Hello everybody, and welcome to this ALNAP Urban webinar. As some of you will know, I think some of you may have been present, last month we held the ALNAP annual meeting on engagement with crisis-affected populations in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where we were very kindly hosted by African Humanitarian Action. And we're joined by members from over, I think, 60 organizations in the ALNAP network. Is that right, Leah? Leah is nodding. So great turnout from the ALNAP membership for that meeting on engagement of crisis-affected populations. One of the panels that we had at that meeting was organized by ALNAP, by Leah Campbell. And it brought together presentations from colleagues in the British Red Cross, Mukuru Slums Development Project from Nairobi in Kenya, and the International Federation of the Red Cross. The presentation was hosted by our colleagues and friends from Group URD, and we recorded it. You should now be able to see a link on your screen. Through the link there you can access the presentation that was made on the engagement of urban crisis-affected populations. And we wanted to really in this webinar pick up on some of the themes and develop some of the themes that came out of that presentation at the annual meeting. One biggie, I think, and it's something that in this webinar series we've encountered before, is the issue of community. So much of humanitarian response relies on community-based mechanisms, community-based targeting, community needs assessment. But of course, as we all know, in cities, communities can be much harder to define. They're much less likely to be geographically defined, to be found in the same place, and any individual, as we all know, can be a member of many different urban communities at the same time, which are located in different places. So this whole issue of community is a challenge to many humanitarians in engaging in response. And because of that, I think following from that, there's the challenge of how to identify the most vulnerable. If a traditional, if you like, a sort of cut and paste traditional humanitarian response may well rely on people knowing their neighbours, knowing where the differentially abled or widows or other disadvantaged people live, and so being able to target vulnerable people because of the nature of this community, because people are all living in a village together. But you know, as certainly as I know as a city dweller, you don't necessarily know everybody who lives in your street, and you don't necessarily in an urban community know who are the most vulnerable. So the challenge of community, it compounds this issue of identifying the most vulnerable people in a response. And I think for these reasons, and for others that we'll explore this afternoon, what we found from the panel is that, you know, engaging urban populations in the processes of an emergency response is not easy, despite the fact that there are many things sort of militating in our favor. Of course, you know, cities, because they have the higher density and higher technology, often, you know, there are more options for partnership in urban work. There are potentially many more community organizations to work with to engage urban people. And of course there are technologies often available which allow engagement. So it's kind of swings, metropolitan swings and roundabouts, and that's really what we wanted to look at today with our expert panel. Before introducing them, just a few points on how we're going to do today's webinar. It's rather different for those of you who've participated in these webinars in the past. This is going to be slightly different in as much as we're experimenting with doing a webinar which doesn't have presentations. Instead, we've got 3 panelists, all with significant operational experience. And what we're going to do is put a number of questions which many of you have kindly submitted before the event, and also any questions that we have time for that are submitted during this event. We're going to put those to our expert panelists. It's taken me a long time to get round to them, but it's definitely been worth the wait. Jan Meewissen, the Risk Reduction and Rehabilitation Coordinator from UN Habitat, who is in Nairobi today. Jan managed a UN Habitat Community Development Program for 10 years and pioneered new ways of working with communities and local governments across 3 continents. So, you know, knowledge in depth here from Jan. Particularly looking at developing methodologies to put communities in charge of their development. And what was interesting here is that a lot of these methodologies were then picked up by UN Habitat globally and used in post-disaster urban response settings. And so we have sort of developmental urban tools which Jan has developed, which have made the leap, as it were, into response and rehabilitation. And on this basis, UN Habitat has since developed the people-centered approach, which it uses for both development and post-disaster contexts. Then we have Jerome Lebleu, Head of Urban Response Technical Department at Global Communities. Jerome is today in Silver Spring, Maryland, and he's going to share experiences from Global Communities' Katia project in Haiti. Some of you will have seen on the urban portal that Global Communities have shared some of their experiences there. We have them on the portal. The Katia project mobilized the Ravine Pintard neighborhood to map, design, and implement shelter and infrastructure reconstruction after the Haiti earthquake. And during this project, Global Communities had to rethink their approach to community leadership and gain community trust. And I think, you know, very interesting, Jerome will be able to tell us a little bit about this and about, you know, what community leadership they thought it looked like and what it actually looked like. Global Communities is currently implementing PRECAD, a rebuilding project which has established community reconstruction centers in Port-au-Prince and around Port-au-Prince. And last and by no means least, I'd like to introduce Karen Jacobson, who's in Geneva and is the coordinator of the Joint IDP Profiling Services, the JIPS. Karen's currently on leave from the Feinstein International Center, where she's research director and leads the Refugees and Forced Migration Program. And again, many excellent resources on the Urban website from that program. She's currently coordinating the JIPS, which is an interagency service providing technical support at field level to agencies and local organizations on IDP profiling. And with a particular set of extremely useful tools, which I know we have drawn on for some of our LMAP work around profiling in urban environments. So Karen, Jerome, and Jan, welcome. And we're delighted that you can join us today.
Thank you, Paul. Let's hope we have a good discussion today. This is Jan.
Thanks, Paul. This is Karen, and nice to meet you all.
Thank you, Paul. Jerome here. Glad to be participating.
And we're very happy to have the three of you. I'm sure we're going to get quite a lot away from today. So with no further ado, let's launch into some of the questions. These are some questions which I think come out of the ALNAP meeting, but which also have been augmented by questions that have been sent in by participants today. Jan, maybe we could start by sort of addressing this point about community. You've developed in a wide variety of different contexts, tools for working with communities. And we mentioned at the beginning this thing that urban and rural communities are very different. I wondered, if you could share your reflections on what urban communities, if one can talk about an urban community and what community means in an urban context.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, this is very important indeed, because communities can have a wide range of meanings. But in order to apply it in the way we work with communities, we really talk about a physically defined community, or let's call it, in other words, a neighborhood. So that a geographic defined community is the group of people which we normally work with. Surely there are other type of communities, but and sometimes we do work with communities of practice as well. If we talk about certain components of our work, dealing with vocational training or so on. But really, when we talk about a target group, people we work with to improve their situation after a disaster, after conflict, it's a geographically defined group of people. That's what we then refer to as community. And in order to make it workable, we also look at the size. I mean, you can't work with too large a group of people, so we try to see how we can divide communities in logically, geographically defined groups to work with and identify within those communities who are really the leaders, what are the existing organizations, what is already there for us to work with in terms of community. So I think that's really the basic principle we start with in defining community and finding the group of people we work with in order to help them to improve their situation.
That's very interesting, Jan. Thank you. So in a way, what, if I understand correctly, what these approaches that you've been working on would tend to do is that you start with a geographical entity, and then look for, sort of a bounded neighborhood or basically a geographical area, and then look for the community social structures which exist within that area, which can then be mobilized. Have I understood that correctly?
Excellent. That is really the only way we feel we can work with communities, by defining that in this geographic sense, and as you said, identify what is already there in terms of social structures, in terms of organizations within that community as a starting point, because they then will be part and parcel of the process which we start up to mobilize these communities, to get them together and work with them through all phases of improving their situation.
And may I ask, what sort of social structures and groups, social groups, have you found? I don't know if this is the kind of thing that one can generalize across 3 continents, but if you can generalize, what sort of groups have you found to be particularly effective in terms of legitimately representing the people who live in an area and liaising between sort of the international organization and that community? What kind of groups work for you?
It depends from area to area, of course, but invariably we do find women's groups. We do find people, women's groups, which are quite often organized around savings and loans. You find that world over, and particularly women groups are very strong in that. So they have already a structure in place, an organization in place. But even simple things like youth clubs, football clubs, even those structures are very useful to have youth having a say in the whole planning process, and later also in the implementation. We also look at particularly trade groups. There may be influential groups on particular trades in that area, and that is quite often useful to identify the leaders of these groups as well. So that really we bring together the various groups which exist in order to start talking about how we can bring the community as a whole together, if that's not yet there. Because quite often we do find, even in urban areas, that there are quite strong community organizations in place. And that's really the first building blocks which we use to start bringing a community together for the particular reason we want to help them after this disaster or after the conflict.
Thank you, Jan. I'd like to pick up on some of those thoughts, but before doing so, Jerome, I wonder if we could turn to you. Jan mentioned this issue of leadership and of community leadership, or leadership of a variety of perhaps different groups within communities. One area that I know that was interesting in the CATIA project was this issue about community leadership, how you gain trust with leaders and with the community. I wondered what your reflections were on identifying communities in that program, and particularly on sort of identifying leaders of communities?
Sure. The CATIA program, which we implemented from 2010 to 2012 in the Ravine Pintade neighborhood of Port-au-Prince, and which was led by my colleague Anne Lee, who's listening in, who's now with the Women's Refugee Commission, and who really was a lot of the inspiration and provided the leadership for this program. You know, it really challenged us in our assumptions about what community engagement meant. And one of the things I think you're referring to that one of the first challenges we had was, as Jan mentioned, we said about working in this neighborhood with a clearly defined geographic area, and we thought we had identified some sub-neighborhoods where we could work, and our initial mobilization strategy was to work with some leaders who we had identified through our initial community engagement. And actually we were a bit surprised but happy to find out and to hear directly from community members who, upon hearing that we would be working with certain leaders, came to us and said that actually they didn't feel that those leaders represented them. They also told us that the sub-neighborhoods we had selected weren't actually the sub-neighborhoods that existed in the neighborhood. And I guess as a result we changed everything in our approach, and we really decided to just decentralize and democratize the entire process. So rather than working with these leaders that we had pre-identified, we decided to make the mobilization and the community engagement a completely open process to anyone in the neighborhood. In an urban context, you know, that certainly is, it can be a more intense process to work with a larger number of actors, but it was also, because in an urban setting it's so fluid, and it just reduces I guess the ability for any local leaders to be as representative of everyone in a neighborhood. And so in a sense it creates an environment where it can be more democratic and give voice to people who maybe wouldn't have had it if we had followed our initial strategy. And so by readapting our methods, we were able to come up with an engagement strategy that everyone felt more comfortable with, and that ended up reflecting the community at large's perspectives and their desires for the program.
It's fascinating. I mean, it makes me wonder. Maybe you could give us some more details on this, because I'm sure a lot of people who are participating will be interested in how global communities did this. I can envision a situation where, you have, to use some of the examples that Jan gave, you have maybe leader of a women's credit group or a couple of women's credit groups, and let's say that the manager of the local boys football team, and perhaps the imam and the minister of the local evangelical church or whatever. You have a variety of different leaders who are all leading sort of elements of the community, who all have some status in the neighborhood, but none of them have any sort of control over each other, and many individuals will feel that none of these people represent them. You're then in a position of having to sort of establish some form of mechanism for representation, which I understand is what global communities did there. Could you tell us a little bit more about the kind of under the hood of this, the mechanics of actually how you went about doing that?
Sure. I think it's important to highlight what the program's approach was, really to maximize accessibility of program staff, of the community to program staff. We had our office in the middle of this neighborhood with everyone there, from the program director to engineers to mobilizers, and we had, our mobilization staff was significant, probably the largest unit within our program, and they were not just sitting in this office, but out in the community at all times. You know, when we heard from the community that the leaders we had identified initially were that they had some concerns about those identified leaders, what we decided to do was, based on the sub-neighborhoods, which the community told us were the correct sub-neighborhoods, we established basically subcommittees within each one. So we informed residents about the project and about the goals of the project and the methodology chosen to implement the project, which was a participatory one, and that it would be up to the community to identify their needs and priorities, and that we would be organizing public events within each of these sub-neighborhoods. Each sub-neighborhood had dedicated mobilizers that worked with each of those committees, and the committees were open to anyone who was willing to participate and were living within that community.
Very interesting. Thank you. Come back to this, actually, this idea of the, because none of this comes for free, evidently, and there's going to be significant time and staffing investments in this, I'd imagine, from your description, which maybe we'll come back to in a minute. Before doing that, I'd like to look at the special case, Karen, if we may, of IDPs, and perhaps more broadly of groups of citizens who may not easily find it easy to pull on the levers of power and influence, if you like, and who might also not really want to be visible even.
Well, hi, Paul, and hello, everyone out there. I'd like to, before I tackle that question, just go back to your first question about these communities in urban areas. And I think as humanitarians, we tend to be a bit narrow in our focus. It seems to me that when we think about urban communities today, we really need to go beyond the urban setting and think about the diasporas, about transnational communities, and the ways in which people living in urban settings are linked both globally to their kin and to others, but also are linked back home or back to the rural areas where they may have come from. And I think we tend to kind of look at target communities for the purposes of programming and so forth, but we forget that these communities are much bigger and more spread out than we tend to think about. And it may be that in thinking about programming, we neglect these additional or these wider communities that are so important for the survival of people living in urban settings. And yeah, it's much easier to, for programming purposes, focus on a small neighborhood and so forth, or even a larger neighborhood. But in my experience, these neighborhoods are really dispersed often, and it seems to me worth it to kind of think more broadly about these communities and how they really function in the world, not just the way that humanitarians understand them and treat them and deal with them, but how they really function. So anyway, I've gone off your question.
No, but with good reason. Thank you for that note.
Sure, I'm happy to revert to your other question, but I forget what it was.
We were talking about community and almost sort of establishing representative mechanisms and sort of the challenges of engaging with some form of community at a neighborhood level, and thinking about the particular challenges that IDPs or other populations who may be outside the political mainstream, who may be socially or economically marginalized, might have in engaging with these kind of mechanisms, in engaging with us as external interveners. And any thoughts you had about what those problems might be and how they might be overcome?
Well, one of the things I think happens with displaced people or even urban migrants, most of whom live mixed together with the other urban poor, these large conglomerates now. One of the issues is to try to understand what the shape of these communities is and where they came from. So for example, many displaced people, let's take Somalia for example, many displaced people moving into Mogadishu from rural areas of Somalia move already in pre-existing communities. They might move in their villages or their small parts of their villages or small, hamlets or whatever it is from rural areas. And so they already are organized when they come. And so there are sort of organic ways to understand these communities rather than communities that are sort of created out of programming or whatever. So it's very important to take an anthropological look at what constitutes these communities from the people's perspective, not our perspective. And in trying to understand the leadership of these communities, it seems to me really important. This is one of the, I think, lessons that has emerged from humanitarian programming. It's very important, as was said earlier, not to identify the wrong people as leaders. As we know, in many communities, not just urban, not just displaced, but many, all kinds of people come forward claiming to represent their so-called communities. And as was said earlier, we then find out later, perhaps too late, that those aren't the right leaders. And it may be that some of the leaders that came from rural areas and so forth may have lost their authority in urban areas over time. But it's really important to understand the way that power and authority exists and is recreated in urban settings. So how to engage with them, I mean, it seems to me one always needs a really good analysis, a really good power analysis before one starts trying to identify leaders. So that didn't help very much, but I think it's really important to understand what we've got, the context, before we jump in too quickly.
Thanks, Karen. I mean, this issue actually, it's not the first time it's come up in these issues, the idea of power analysis and context analysis, which takes, without perhaps having the possibility to do it over quite a long period of time, some form of rapid analytical model which allows some understanding of social structures and power within social structures in an urban environment. I wonder, Karen, I'll ask all three panelists in turn, if you could actually point us to any resources around how to do these forms of analyses, and also if there is anyone participating in the webinar who has resources, if they could just type them in and send them to us, because I think this is a very interesting area for quite a lot of people in this urban community practice. Karen, any resources that you know of?
The notion of doing a stakeholder analysis, that's become a bit of a cliche, but I think that's a good place to start. As long as when we think about stakeholders, we go beyond the sort of main humanitarian development organizations, government actors and so forth, and really try to dig into the community stakeholders who are involved. And there, it seems to me, you would get into a whole range of different players that would be important to identify. Okay, but as to actual places to find tools, well, I always like to advocate the JIPS, the JIPS, the Joint IDP Profiling Service website, which has a large database of tools. It's called the PARC database. I'm happy to send you those. There are toolkits. UNHCR has a very large, the SENS toolkit. There are many such toolkits around that might help with this contextual analysis. IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, has very good and analytical approaches that could be used, and I'm happy to send you some of these later.
That would be great, Karen, and we'll send those around through the community of practice after this. Anything, Jerome, anything of this nature, any sort of guidance on the mechanics of your approach, or other guidance that you used that you would be able to share with us?
I would echo Karen's point. In the stakeholder analysis is one of the modules within our participatory engagement methodology that we use in our programs. But I would also like to highlight the importance of having strong local staff and relying on those personnel, which are really vital to our success. Oftentimes when you're working in this kind of environment, it's very intense and time is an issue, and you may not have the ability to, or the luxury to, or even have that really dedicate and really try to understand a culture and a place. And I think that Karen's point about looking at it, the anthropology of it, and trying to understand how social structures work, those local staff can really be are vital to understanding how those power dynamics work generally in a culture, and they may not know the exact neighborhood or place, but they can be a very, they were for us a huge guide to being able to develop an effective strategy.
Thanks. And Jan, same question to you. Over time, what have you found to be the most useful, if you like, formal resources, but also most useful ways of kind of getting the information about how the dynamics of society within these neighborhood areas?
One of our experiences certainly is that one of the most important elements when you get the communities together, when you help the communities to get organized, is inclusiveness. Ensure that all groups within that community are really part and parcel of the whole process you are going to start. Because if you exclude certain elements of that community, willingly or unwillingly, that later is going to give you problems. So inclusiveness is important, hence indeed you do need, as Jerome says, very good local organizers, local community organizers who know the dynamics, who understand who the people are, what the situation is, in order to come up with that overarching committee which takes the lead in that whole process of improving a community. And agree with Karen as well, you really have to understand well what the various components of the community are, so that what you set up as a community development or improvement committee is all inclusive. Thereafter, you can then set up subcommittees which are dealing with specific elements, and people can come forward to say, yes, I want to be part of this. But it is important to have an overarching committee which is all inclusive. Not only all inclusive within the community, the next step, and I'd like to move now a little bit forward here, is to also involve local government in this process. Because that community which you're going to, organization which you help to set up or sanction if it already exists, needs to be recognized by the local governments. In any process of improvement, they have a say in what is going to happen in that area. And therefore, if the community which comes forward with their plans, with their ideas and is going to implement it, needs to be sanctioned by that local government. So that interrelation to us is always extremely important in order to make sure that what you are going to do has the stamp of approval of that local government.
Well,
so their involvement is there from an early stage as well.
I'm glad you brought that up, Jan, actually, because there have been a couple of questions from participants which I think relate to that, and which I would like to put to you. Before I do so, I just a personal reflection, if I may, and please feel free, any of you, to disagree with this. But one thing that it may be important to bear in mind, I think, when thinking about sort of context analysis, sociological or anthropological analysis of the city, is that whilst one might have a map, that map is not the territory. You know, that it's these stakeholder analyses can give almost a spurious sense of sort of fixed social groups, when the reality is that whatever map you have, whilst it gives an outline, there's going to be a lot of change, mobility, interaction, and politics going on between those groups as well. And so perhaps it's important to recognize the perfect analysis is never going to be possible. I think Jerome was driving towards, sometimes good enough is going to have to be good enough. But I put that out there as a thought. And then I put these questions that came, a specific and a more general question, Jan. The specific was exactly that, about if you are working on a neighborhood level, how do you practically ensure that that is articulated with citywide planning and citywide response? How do you make that relationship work? So that was the first question, and a related, perhaps slightly broader question I wanted to put to you was, what sort of problems and challenges, what are the big problems that you have encountered with a neighborhood approach?
And a bit back to what I said earlier, the problems normally pop up if in the process of organizing the community, mobilizing them, you have not been inclusive. By excluding certain groups at a later stage, these problems are popping up. So therefore, investing in knowing for sure that the various interest groups within the community are also included in the whole planning process is very, very vital. And the best people to know are the community members themselves. So make sure you really explore very well amongst the various people you're working with that you have been inclusive. And nobody better to know than these community members themselves who live in the place, or even if they have come recently, they have then social networks, they have the economic networks, and from that you can find out if indeed what you're setting up as a committee to deal with the improvement of the area is inclusive. So that's really our most important lesson. And when we have forgotten that, it came back like a boomerang.
This particular piece, Jan, about the articulating, practically kind of linking the neighbourhood to the broader urban response. I wonder what your experience on that has been. You began to talk about it just now.
In many of the cities where we work, there are city councils. City councils have councillors, so those are politicians responsible for a particular area in town, who represent that area in town. And that's a particularly interesting breed to work with, because those politicians do feel responsible for that particular area they are not governing, but they are representing. Hence, involving them in the process is of particular importance and not easy, because quite often they feel big entitlements for themselves. So how to involve them needs some particular care in a way that they are not going to dominate the process, but in a way that they see that indeed what comes out of the whole process is to the benefit of the people and to them. So that usually takes some careful political handling to get the politicians for these areas involved, but also in general the planning departments of the cities who have plans for certain areas. Make sure you know this, so that whatever comes out, even if people have ideas, that it does stroke with the plans which the city have developed for these areas. So the interlinkage with the city and their planning department is important too, so that whatever is being developed is within the plans which have been made by the city for these areas. So again, an important interaction between the city authorities and the people of certain areas.
Thank you. Jerome, I wondered how this worked, you know, in your experience in the Katia project. How was that sort of taking? How were you taking account of the formal structures, formal municipal structures of government?
Well, I think that, you know, building on what Jan was saying, that there's a bit of an inherent tension between working at the neighborhood level, which is, I think, necessary for working in an urban context, as opposed to working with you know, individual households, and yet, you know, placing the neighborhood within the larger context of the city. What we saw in Haiti after the earthquake was a context where you had weak institutional capacity because of, for a variety of reasons, but certainly exacerbated by the impact that the earthquake had on public functions in Port-au-Prince. And because of the way, you know, somewhat as a humanitarian community, we're set up from a systems perspective. I think, you know, we have there's a great desire and almost need to do something and to demonstrate results, and yet with the density of an urban context, you know, planning at a higher level is really, in an ideal world, would have been more present and would have helped to organize actors in a more efficient way. You know, one of the unfortunate things that we saw in this sort of, well, I don't know if it's unfortunate, but it's certainly there was almost seemed at times to be competition for neighborhoods to work in among humanitarian actors, and I say that from an organization that was you know, one of those actors. So I think that we're set up systematically to a certain extent with donors and humanitarian actors, institutions to respond in this way, but it would also I guess I would plead for better coordination. And I think to a certain extent, answering that first question, working within plans, if they exist, would be ideal. How did we include specifically us, government institutional actors? We had, this is related to my first part of my answer, we worked with the municipality of Port-au-Prince and with primarily with the Ministry of Public Works in Haiti at the national level. They had officials that were specifically supposed to be tracking this project, but frankly, with the amount of work going on and the number of organizations working, it's very difficult for one person to be really following and working on the level that would have been the best possible solution. So we were coordinating everything that we were doing with local authorities, but probably not to the extent necessary for there to be a seamless transition between what we were doing during the program and what the kinds of services that the community could expect from their local government once the program was over.
And this is interesting, I think, because one of the things that came up several times at the ALNAP Engaging Crisis Affected People Conference in Addis was the danger, of course, of sort of external of our organizations establishing almost parallel state structures or parallel municipal structures. On the one hand, the desire to set up representative governance within, if you like, project or program governance for humanitarian responses, but the sort of rather discrete mechanisms for program or neighborhood governance that we create to do that can actually in some ways sort of threaten or set up an almost parallel state or parallel city. And that was the point that came over several times in Addis, and I think that underlies the importance of articulating whatever it is that we're doing with these state structures, even though, as you're pointing out, in a situation like that in Port-au-Prince, those state structures are very overburdened and finding it very difficult to fulfill their functions entirely. We've had a contribution from Emily Rogers from HAP's experience in Haiti on the issue of tools, a camp committee assessment tool which is designed to understand the groups that exist, how they work, and how the degree to which the wider community feels these groups represent their needs, which can be used in both urban and rural context. And that tool will be putting links to that. Thank you very much for that, Emily. We'll be putting links to that on the community of practice after this site. Karen, I wanted to ask you a separate question, but before going there, I wondered if you had any reflections on these issues about articulating neighborhood or more local activities. You'd already spoken about the importance of seeing the bigger picture. Any sort of practical examples of how that could be done or how not to do it even?
Our work at GIPS, our profiling that we do doesn't usually focus at, I guess, a low neighborhood level. So I don't think I can speak to that. I would say, however, that on the matter of coordination, I think one of the most important lessons that we've learned over this time is that it's at the beginning of any program, whether it's a profiling, whether it's a program, whether it's research, it's really important to identify all actors that might be interested in the information, the data, the results. And I would say what we do in a profiling study is that we spend a lot of time at the beginning of a project creating a coordination platform in which humanitarian development and particularly government agencies are brought together. And I would say that one perhaps entry point when it comes to the government is to engage with technical agencies and units who are often much less politicized. For example, we work a lot with statistics offices or with even the census offices, municipal mapping and so forth. These kinds of offices or agencies are less politicized and often very keen to engage and to build capacity with outside organizations. And we tend to do this at the city-wide level or the municipal or even the national level. But I would think that the same principle is at work at a much smaller scale when it comes to neighborhoods to find out, who is doing technical work and who could be engaged. I do think that really, if there is no point in working on one's own, and nobody here is doing that, but creating a platform where everybody works together and ensuring that the platform meets regularly, that there is someone who is managing the platform, ensuring that meetings happen, ensuring communication happens, ensuring that there's buy-in from the relevant actors. That piece can really, I think, assist and ensure that the whole process goes forward more smoothly, and that there is buy-in certainly for results at the end. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I do think that creating some sort of coordination mechanism or platform at the beginning, even if it fails in the end, it's really not going to work unless something like that is attempted and resourced.
A message that I'm hearing from all of our discussants today is that this old thing that if you think it's expensive in terms of time or money to do these things up front, look at how expensive it is not to do them when it all falls apart later. The thing actually that I wanted to begin by asking you, Karen, on, which links in rather nicely to this, I think, and thank you for, by the way, sorry, as a side thing, thank you for pointing out the importance of the technical and line ministries. I think there have been quite a lot of good examples, particularly in the area of WASH, working with sort of fairly, I suppose some ministries will tend to go quite local. They will tend to disaggregate to quite local areas, and sort of sanitation and water supply often do that. So that can be an entry point, I think. The question that I wanted to ask actually was more about feedback and accountability in sort of urban programming. What have we seen works? I mean, obviously a lot of what I think we've been thinking about so far has been about sort of programmatic design and ensuring that the governance of programming and the inputs in terms of knowledge inputs from the community are represented in the program design and so on. But two things in addition to that I hoped we could explore. One is, how do these mechanisms and perhaps other mechanisms ensure that our programming is consistently getting feedback on its own success or failure so that it's able to adjust? How do you use these committees and other mechanisms to provide feedback over time? So that's if you like one question. And or equally importantly, how do our organizations ensure that they can be held to account by these mechanisms or by other mechanisms if we are doing things which sections of the local population do not think we should be doing? I wondered, Karen, it's a broad question about both feedback and accountability, so don't feel you have to answer it all. But if you had any experience of this, and particularly perhaps if you had any experience of this for people who are sort of subgroups of the population and potentially marginalized in the way that IDPs can be.
This is the big question, accountability. I think, wow, I mean, if we could answer this or solve it, we'd be a long way, because it's just like you say, there's a lot on the front end and not much on the evaluation, on the exit strategies, on the monitoring of how the program is actually doing in terms of impact, and especially, like you say, monitoring and how the people that we're trying to help, work with, what they think of this program. It seems to me that we, sort of a cliche to say that there's not enough monitoring and evaluation that happens, but that is still the case today. We're not adequately and properly monitoring these programs. And it seems to me that one issue that comes up is the problem of the exit strategy and how humanitarian agencies are going. What is the cycle of the program? How is it going to end, and what's going to happen at the end, and when is it going to end? And is there an end in sight? And what will people do? It seems that so often these programs just run out of money and resources, and everyone just leaves. It seems that, to me, there should be a proper trajectory of the program that is tied closely into the people that we're trying to work with. and that unless that accountability and that engagement with the communities, finding ways to engage with them happens, it's really, we're back to the same old piling in resources at the beginning, not understanding what effect, if any, they've had, and then leaving. And I would go back again to the comment that was made at the beginning by Jan and others about the importance of national staff. It seems to me this is such a neglected aspect of understanding programming, that the national staff, most who are working in humanitarian agencies, especially those who've been there a long time, really do understand these programs much better than international staff. And we really should find a way to engage and have the national staff help us understand the impact of these programs better. You know, it's one thing to try to engage communities and find leaders and find representatives and try to find discriminated minorities and so forth. But often the people who really have the best insight about that are the really good national staff that have been working on this for a long time and are dedicated. So I think that's a good place to start, at least.
And could I also underline, I mean, as well as this point about national staff, I'd just like to underline something else that you mentioned there, Karen, because it does seem to be so important in so many different contexts, and that is this: if one's asking for feedback or being held accountable, it is so important to say what one is accountable for and what one is asking for feedback on. And I think this has come out through Alnap's recent work on feedback, which I hope many of the participants will have seen, the beneficiary feedback mechanisms work. The absolute sort of foundational element of, with this humanitarian programming in urban environments, saying this is what we're trying to do, this is who we're doing it with, this is what we're not doing, and this is how long we'll be here for. Because that sort of basic information about a program, which isn't always given, is the foundation to allow people to kind of hold you to account if you actually do deliver on that or not, and also to provide feedback if they think that's a good idea. So it's an obvious point, but thank you for making it, because I think it's a really important one. On this issue of feedback, Jan, feedback and accountability mechanisms, I wonder if you have any, you know, in addition to what Karen suggested, if you have any other tips for us.
Yes, certainly. In terms of accountability, we really feel that our accountability goes to the community first. We are there to help a particular community, so we're really accountable to them in the first place. Not only us as the external party supporting them, but also the processes which we set up, we try to set it up in a way that the community is also accountable to itself, in the sense that the way you set up the programs, try to involve them in a way that the feedback from that community goes first to that community. We have seen too often, for instance, that when surveys take place, all the results of these surveys go outside to the agencies which are supporting that community. But the feedback is not given to the communities. Well, they should be the principal actors, or they should be the ones to move the whole program forward. If they do not receive the feedback what came out of those surveys, surely they are disadvantaged. So that, I think, for us is an important principle, to always involve the communities in the feedback and be accountable to that community. Then we have also set up some mechanisms to make that happen. For instance, if you talk about the implementation phase, which will be implementing what communities themselves have decided they want to do, with the funding which is available, with the technical support which is available, is community contracts. So the funding available for undertaking certain things, particularly the more simple things, but even up to rebuilding homes, can be done through community contracts. And then community members with whom we sign a contract as if they are, no, not as if they are a full partner in that program, hence funding will be handed over to them to undertake these activities which they have identified need to be done. It could be the simple things as rubble removal, but it could be more complicated ones as helping members of the community to rebuild their homes, and the funding to be channeled through these communities, through a contract, so that also they are directly responsible for the funding to move that to the members of their community and make them accountable for it. So that's again that accountability which we really like to build in our approaches, and feel that the community should be the first one to whom everybody is accountable. We as outside agencies, but also members of the community who undertake certain activities in terms of rehabilitation.
Thank you. Very, very interesting and common sense approach. And I also, just to underline, like this idea about just remembering who owns the information. You know, that part of this feedback, part of the accountability is actually asking who is this for and who owns this stuff anyway. So thank you for bringing that up. Jerome, what have your experiences in Port-au-Prince been around feedback, and also around the degree to which you feel that the community has been able to hold you to account?
Well, you know, I think as part of this program we had a variety of tools, instruments that facilitated feedback, such as a hotline that could be called at, I'm not sure if it's 24 hours, but nearly at any moment, so that people felt free to call in and provide information. But I think that and that's an effective tool, but I think really it's about two themes that we mentioned earlier on. It's about transparency and accessibility, and what you said earlier, Paul, about being very upfront about the nature of the program, the objectives, and what we are trying to accomplish. I think that one of the caveats to that is that in these contexts it's very difficult to know sometimes exactly what will come of a program. You may write a proposal with certain assumptions, but quickly find that the reality on the ground is different. In a humanitarian context, there's changes related to pricing and things like that. Markets are incredibly dynamic, and with the influx of donor money, they're not always responding to market price signals. So I think you have to be careful about what you can promise of what you can and can't do. But within those bounds, I think it's vital to be transparent and outline what the program is about and what can be done through it. And accessibility through the establishment, as I mentioned earlier, our office within the neighborhood was a very important medium for us to, in an open door policy in that office enabled the community to feel comfortable telling us at any point if they had any issues with what was going on. And also, the mobilizers out in the neighborhood at all times was an important mechanism for us to get feedback. One anecdote I wanted to provide is the program itself ended up selecting a series of activities to implement to reconstruct this neighborhood, but it was done through a participatory planning process. First, the mapping of risks with the communities, and then a participatory planning process where that really empowered residents to say, these are the things that we want, and facilitating a process of negotiation among a variety of neighborhood stakeholders to identify what kinds of interventions they wanted. And in what we came to see is that these beneficiaries, instead of maybe the word beneficiaries, maybe perhaps a better word is consumers. They're consumers of the services that we are providing, and we found that in terms of touching on accountability, they would, as during construction of footpaths, retaining walls, residents would come and tell us, if they felt the work was not being done properly, up to, very specific, detailed things, because they were involved in the planning process, they were heavily invested in the program and were not shy about sharing their concerns or about anything that was going on during the implementation of the program. One other issue I'd like to touch on related to the neighborhood approach, and this is something that we found to be a great challenge, and maybe a limitation of the neighborhood approach is that when you're working in an extremely dense urban area with where there are needs throughout, it's very difficult to somewhat arbitrarily say, to pick a boundary and say, well, we're working in this neighborhood. Our example was we were working on one side of a ravine, and just facing the other side of the ravine was another neighborhood that was just as impacted by the earthquake as ours. And we were certainly felt like we were accountable to, quote unquote, our neighborhood, but there was certainly some concern across the ravine, just next door, literally a 2-minute walk from some places where, what level of accountability do we have to all these other adjacent neighborhoods as well? Obviously, funds for any program are limited, but it's a challenge in these urban neighborhoods to manage that accountability to not only to the residents for the neighborhood that we were working with, but others in the surrounding areas as well.
Thank you. I think that opens a really important perspective on accountability as well, which we all need to bear in mind, that one is accountable to the disaster-affected community, of course, and not just necessarily to that bit of the community in which one is working. And so that's a really interesting thought, and I think has quite important ramifications. Victoria from Christian Aid has reminded us, we did talk about community-based organizations, but we didn't talk specifically about those organizations which exist for developmental or humanitarian response purposes, local partner organizations who, of course, many northern NGOs are engaged with. So it is important, I think, to recognize the potential of these CBOs and developmental organizations in cities. There are some notes on the importance of that in, I believe, the ALNAP lessons paper on urban response. Some of you may want to refer to. Also, more generally on the issue of working with partner organizations, there is a research document recently produced by several UK NGOs, including Christian Aid, called Missed Opportunities, and it's available among other places on the ALNAP website. And I would recommend that when we're thinking about the potential of responding with communities, we think about looking at these national NGOs or local NGOs, and the Missed Opportunities report is a good place to start with that. So thank you for reminding us of that, Victoria. There are many other questions that we would like to answer, but time, as ever, is against us. So some of these discussions will continue in the community of practice further to today's webinar. I'd like to just finish then by asking our panelists briefly, in a couple of sentences or a couple of paragraphs, maybe more realistically, in terms of ensuring the highest possible level of engagement of disaster-affected city dwellers in an emergency response, what are the key 2 or 3 things that we absolutely need to bear in mind, particularly perhaps those things which are specific to the city and different from urban response? So what if we could do nothing else, are the 2 or 3 things that we must remember to do, particularly the ones that are specifically urban? Jan, could I go to you first with that?
What comes to mind in this case is something not to forget, and that is, I've said it earlier, but I think it is important to stress, we have to work with the city's authorities and rather strengthen them and strengthen the local institutions in the process of engaging with the communities and working with the communities, rather than sidelining them and setting up parallel structures. And too often I've seen that happening. These parallel structures may seem very efficient and may seem the best way of helping the community within a particular time frame. However, if we have alienated the local governments in that process, we may have done more harm than good. So that's one point I really like to make the importance of not setting up the parallel structures, but strengthening the structures which are there, helping also those municipalities to get back. For instance, an example is when a city is suddenly inundated with a large number of refugees from neighboring countries or neighboring areas, the pressure on those city authorities to provide the services which they're supposed to provide, such as water, waste management, drainage systems, are enormously strained due to the large influx of people within that municipality. If we then ignore this particular issue rather than helping the municipalities to address that, I think we've missed opportunities. So that, I think, is something which I like to stress as a very typical difference between the rural and the urban approaches. Recognize that our authorities in place, work with them, strengthen them, help them in order to help the communities. I think that's really my major point, actually, is the difference between a rural response and an urban response to disaster.
Thank you very much, Jan. Karen, maybe the same question to you in closing.
I mean, Jan said it really well. Totally agree with him. The other thing that I would add, and it's very much relates to that, is that it's important to understand existing networks and not necessarily community-based organizations, but existing services and networks that are being provided by the people themselves in the target areas. And if I could just make a plug for a book that I've been reading recently by Dayo Olopaidi, the Nigerian journalist, and I'm not saying her name properly, I'm sure. The book's called Breaking Rules and Making Change in Modern Africa, and she really sets out some interesting ideas about what's new and different in urban Africa today, because I think that, like we've all been saying, that working in urban areas presents real opportunities to go beyond the same old traditional humanitarian approaches. I think everyone really needs to kind of push beyond what we've always been doing and to look at what's working. And it's the private sector, often the informal sector, that's working, that's making a difference for people, and trying to feed into that rather than, just like Jan said, creating new organizations or specifically supporting humanitarian organizations when in fact other kinds of social and civic organizations, networks and services are in place already. It seems to me that's the most important piece, and that and working with local authorities like Jan says.
Thank you, Karen. And finally, Jerome, your key message to the group today in terms of how to do it differently.
Well, but the first thing I think is just acknowledging that urban context is much more fluid and fast changing, and so we need to accept uncertainty and just understand that our plans will go wrong. But then, echoing what Karen just said, our plans will go wrong, but ask the people. Communities have solutions, develop solutions on their own before anyone comes in to work with them, and so I think that was a key point. Many of these solutions to some of the the problems that we might find in our programs already exist within communities, and it's a question of finding out what they are. And the third point I would say is the same. Again, Karen made this point just before me, but engage the private sector. They are providing services to communities. Cities often are organized around commercial activity, jobs, employment, and these are systems and actors that will be there long after a humanitarian actor will have left. So that's another way to increase sustainability of interventions, along with working with local authorities point that Jan made.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all through. Very privileged to being able to get the time of three experts with so much rich, deep expertise in working in this area. Thank you all of you who joined to the conversation today. Many of whom I see from the list are also urban experts in their own right. We would ask you to stay engaged with this conversation. We'll be continuing the conversation on the community of practice. So if you're not members of the community of practice, do please join and help keep the conversations going. We'll also be sending you a survey for those of you who participated. We're keen to make these webinars as useful to the humanitarian community as possible. So do please take a couple of minutes, which is all it really takes to respond to the survey, and let us know your thoughts. We do take them into account in terms of planning the webinar series. Future topics in the series, we're going to be looking at mapping, which comes back a little bit to what we were speaking about today, at urban assessments, and working with local municipalities. So some of the issues that came out in this engagement seminar we'll look at in more depth later as the year progresses. It goes only to say thank you very much to everybody for taking part this afternoon. And for those of you who are celebrating Easter, to wish you a very happy Easter. And to those of you who are not, just to wish you a very happy week ahead. So thank you for joining us, and we will be speaking soon in our next webinar.